Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Their Own Words podcast. My name is Danny.
And my name's Ava.
And today we're going to be talking about life in the Victorian workhouse. Now, the title of this episode is A Victorian Nightmare, and that is true. This is one of the worst places that you could possibly go, and nobody enjoyed their time here. But it was so famous because of the horrors that were experienced there and because so many people did have to go. In Dickens's classic Oliver Twist, Oliver was raised in the workhouse. And I think probably most of us are familiar with that infamous saying, "Please, sir, can I have some more?" Which is from one of the films that's been adapted from Dickens's work. He was asking for more gruel, which is like a terrible porridge that was quite common in the workhouses. The food there was bad. The life there was bad. People were often taken advantage of and abused. The reason these places existed is they were essentially places for poor people to go, paupers as they were known, when they couldn't afford to live on their own, they couldn't afford food, and it was a form of unemployment aid, really. It was public relief paid for from taxes collected via the Poor Law Amendment Act, which was introduced in 1834. England actually has a long history of poor laws and poor houses, but this peculiar format of workhouse that became so popular during Victorian times lasted from about 1830 to around 1930. And one of the reasons it was so terrible is because they really wanted to keep people from claiming this public aid. You know, ideally to keep costs low. The government's intent from the start was to make the conditions far from ideal because these people should be providing for themselves. They shouldn't need to come here. It was really meant to discourage people from wanting to go there. I mean, already life in Victorian Britain for the working poor wasn't great, so you can see why the government might be fearful that, if we're dishing out free food and work and a place to sleep, we could have people showing up in droves. But really, they went over the top and making this a terrible
too far
place.
The other way.
Yeah, exactly. It really wasn't appealing. People were petrified of it. Food was terrible. People were treated poorly. It was also a hotbed for sickness and disease. So we're going to read to you today from some letters from people who were in the workhouse or maybe on their way there.
Yeah. So these are letters from people who were in the workhouse, and they wrote to the Poor Law Commission to complain about the poor conditions within the workhouses. So there were 3 commissioners that you could address your letter to until 1847, when the commission was abolished in favor of a new board. So this is essentially people writing to complain about their treatment in the workhouses with the hopes that something would be done about it. This letter is dated February 20th, 1856. Gentlemen, I beg to be excused in trespassing upon your time and hope my humble application will receive your most kind considerations. The particulars of this is in consequence of my distressed condition. I am a widow with 1 daughter, who is in a very bad state of health and not able to follow constantly her employment. I am also afflicted, and can only casually perform labour, which leaves me in a very depressed condition. I have a son who for a short period supported me, but he has enlisted in the army and gone to serve our most gracious Queen, which leaves me unsupported at an advanced age. I have been a ratepayer in Barnsley, and hope, while my son is serving his country, that you, sirs, will assist me in obtaining that relief which you may deem right, in order that I may be saved from going into the Union House in Barnsley. I have applied to the Board of Guardians, and the house is offered to me, whereas my daughter would be left homeless or be compelled to go in with me. She is 17 years of age, and by proper attention she may be able to labour after she passes her critical years. As I stated in the commencement that myself and daughter can labour partially, I beg, gentlemen, that you will give such instructions to the Board of Guardians as will lead to a small amount of outdoor relief, and with what little we can earn we shall be able to maintain ourselves, and at the same time my best thanks will be the reward of your indulgence, and hopes you will excuse imperfections. I remain your most humble and obedient servant, Mary Powdersley. P.S. I hope, gentlemen, to receive your instruction at the same time. I beg to be excused, and hope by next board day I shall receive your indulgence. M.P.
Interesting that she's appealing to the best part of her nature here. Really, she sounds like a fairly upstanding citizen. Her son is in the army. She's lost that bonus income that she had from him when he was with her. And she's really just relying on these guys to take pity on her and give her some other form of relief than sending her to the workhouse.
Yeah, it's interesting. She mentions, like, perhaps she's trying to garner favor from the board by saying, I was supported by my son, but he's enlisted in the army. He's gone to serve his country. So, please give me some financial aid because I'm an upstanding woman who has a son who's serving his country, kind of thing. And it's interesting, the date, 1856, this would have been during the Crimean War, which we'll see some overlap in our episodes because obviously when we talk about Florence Nightingale, we'll also be talking about the Crimean War.
Yeah, so quite an interesting letter from this lady. Let's go to the next one. I will read this one, which is dated for 4th of March, 1843, so about 13 years previous. This one really caught my attention when we were doing our research. It says, "Honored Sir, I hope that you will pardon my presumption in addressing this to you, but I have been most cruelly used here by the master, and almost crushed to death by him throwing me down and lying on me with his knees on my chest, so that I can hardly draw my breath. I'm an old man, 69 years of age, and not able to bear such usage. There is no such another place as this in England. It is a complete brothel, and every sort of vice is encouraged here by the master and the doctor. I hope you will be so kind as to have my case investigated, for I am at present very ill from the bad usage I received from the master. I remain yours, Anthony Perry." So he's actually being beaten up, and it's interesting that he even says, "I'm 69, so I can't endure this." It's almost taken for granted that this normally happens. People do get beaten up, but I just can't deal with it because of how old I am.
This man is 69 years old. I really don't know that many people who at 69 are still working and working in, grueling conditions nonetheless. He should be retired. He should be hanging out with his grandchildren, relaxing. But this wasn't the case in Victorian Britain. This man has to work in order to
live, essentially. And that's exactly it. In Victorian times, this was the reality. There was no such thing as retirement. There's no old age security. There's no government pension. This was the government pension. If you didn't have family that could provide for you and care for you into your old age, you had to provide for yourself. And in this guy's case, he couldn't provide for himself enough doing any other job, so he ended up in the workhouse, and this is really sad.
Yeah, it is. It's a very sad entry. And you mentioned the fact that, people work till death. And given the fact that this is Victorian times we're talking about as well, so there's not as long of a lifespan as there is now. He's probably very close in years to the end of his life, and yet he's working kind of his fingers to the bone in these terrible conditions and being abused, essentially. So this is a very sad and somber entry.
And that's why it's called the Victorian Nightmare. This is the workhouse. It is what it was.
Yeah, and nightmare in more than one ways as well, or in more than one way as well. He notes it's a complete brothel and every sort of vice is encouraged. And I just think this is really interesting. You can imagine what kinds of things are going on. It's just very interesting when we compare to, we talked about in the Easter episode, this idea that Britain was still very much a Christian nation. Even if some people weren't going to church every Sunday, Christian morals were codified into British society. And so we talked about that idea that Christianity still very much kind of was the lifeblood of the nation. Yet there was this level of society, particularly common among the poorer people, where it was kind of, everyone was left to their own vices and devices. And, anything could happen. Any kind of debauchery would be taking place.
Yeah, there definitely was, I think, throughout history, there's elements of this you can see in different sources that the aristocracy generally thought the poor less capable of living virtuous lives, which is really quite interesting. Although they were encouraged to, I think it's not so much about the poor as a whole in this case, but interesting to say that it's encouraged here by the master. So many poor people were virtuous, actually. Many working people were very virtuous and very pious. And yet this master and the doctor, who seem to be the ones, according to Anthony, who are encouraging this type of behavior, they probably still would have had to present on the exterior this very morally upright image. And, we're encouraging people to do the right things here at the workhouse. Don't you worry about what's going on in here. But then behind closed doors, sadly, we see this not only in workhouses, but in boarding schools and all types of different institutions. This was often the case in Victorian times.
Yeah, and I think we'll kind of circle back to that idea of the perceived worth of, the different classes kind of at the end of this episode.
So we'll move on now to the next letter that we have for you guys. This one was written on the 10th of October, 1870. So jumping ahead a few years here, and this is written to the inspector of the unions.
To the Inspector of Unions, I have taken it upon myself to tell you, for the goings-on here are abominable. A woman can't go out for a day who has not been out for months, and tells her that he shall not let her go out while she stops in the building. Another woman can get out every month and asks for a day and stays 2 or 3 drinking in bad company along with other women. A woman got 2 people locked up last week. One old woman for 2 days. The old man got fetched out again. They were both above 60 years old. The porter gets the schoolmaster to write for him because he can't write himself. I had my discharge and went out. I came back again and was locked up from Saturday until Monday for it. With a poorly child of 9 months, half starved to death, and when I stopped to see my child on Sunday, the parties had the impudence to ask me which was the best thing, getting children or having them. I told him I did not keep such things in my head. He said it was no use talking to me, so he ordered me up the receiving ward. Again, there was an old man locked up last Saturday for asking for a drink of water. The pudding was all dough, and a good deal of it left, but, sirs, the cause of this letter is that today, at dinner, a poor law inmate with only one leg happened to come in with a rather dirty face when they were saying grace before dinner. The schoolmaster pushed him like pushing a block of wood, and sternly asked him how was it that he did not wash his face. He calmly replied, I had not time, sir. The schoolmaster waited until grace was sung, and he had taken hold of his collar and nearly throttled him, and pushed him down the dining hall, catching the poor man, whose leg that has been cut off at every table and form, which is a bench. The poor boy screamed as well as he could, and the schoolmaster knocked his poor face against the door shamefully, and then locked him up. He had to go without breakfast 3 times last week, nobody knows what for, and yesterday the same thing. He had had no dinner today. When they had all gone out, the porter held every boy's hand, and the schoolmaster caned everyone's hand until they were shameful to be seen. When they came in the yard after, when the schoolmaster was pushing him down, both men, women, and children cried shame, and caused an uproar. Mr. Wright came in and told them he would cut them into mincemeat. Now it is worse than a prison. Mr. Wright told us we lived too well and did too little. Those that will work may work and get called for it, and those that won't work get best thought of. One woman I know sat up whilst 10 minutes to 4 the day before the flower show, sewing muslin dresses and a white petticoat up for the mistress and her 2 daughters. She sat repeatedly 1 or 2 nights every week knitting for her, and then got called names by the mistress. The meals are nearly always late, and they are ashamed to ring the bell. We repeatedly get called to our meals an hour behind time instead of being rung to it. We cannot get to see the rules of the workhouse. They are hung in the dining, and we cannot get to read. We are driven in and out like pigs. One woman was fetching coals out of the men's court for the wash-house when she saw the porter knock one old man down, and begin with another. Are such things allowed, sir? If they are paupers, they are treated worse than pigs. The porridge comes in sour as buttermilk. Last Thursday, all that had porridge on the women's side said it was buttermilk, for it was racked, and as sour this morning it was salt as brine, like salt water. If we are fed too well on that, we can be fed on swill, which is pig's food, at once. No one can get to see the Board of Guardians, since you came. Mr. Wright put names down then because he was in a manner forced. I faced the board for a couple of shillings to take me to Sheffield. They would not give me it, but ordered me into the workhouse again, and told me I could walk that distance. I should not be here if they looked after my husband. A warrant has been out for his apprehension. Sir, to let you know I can face out. All I have written, I shall sign my name. Rachel Ann Sanderson.
It is absolutely horrifying to hear what's happening in here. It's easy to skip over because there's just so much in here, and we don't know exactly everything that's going on here, but the porridge is like buttermilk, so it's unedible. Like, if we actually put ourselves in the shoes of these people, they wake up in the morning and they go to bed in basically hunger, in pain, it's probably cold, and they're being completely abused. I mean, we see this throughout history. I mean, whether you're talking about the Nazi concentration camps or other instances where people are given power over other people. And essentially, these people in the workhouse are dehumanized by the people who are running it. And they're treated absolutely terribly.
Yeah. It's interesting. She talks about Mr. Wright, who I would assume is like the master. She says, he told us we lived too well and did too little. I just think that's indicative of the opinions of, poor people at that time. There was no kind of respect for them, no kind of value of their life. And they're literally working in these horrible conditions for basically nothing. And they're still being told that they lived too well and did too little, that they're lazy somehow.
Yeah, it's the pendulum swing. Like today, we think we deserve everything. Mm-hmm. But in those days especially, you deserved absolutely nothing. And it was obviously made clear to these people. It seems so bizarre for us to wrap our heads around. But there were people in Victorian society who thought, you guys are getting free government handouts. Like, you should be grateful, even if you're getting beaten up on the weekend or whatever, which is just terrible.
Yeah, and it's also interesting the mention of the cane as well. Corporal punishment was pretty common back then, even in schools. So even not in situations such as this, but corporal punishment was not, you wouldn't blink at that. That was just kind of part and parcel of Victorian life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the guy with one leg is probably the saddest story. Yeah. Who knows how or why he wandered in there. And you can tell that this guy was just looking for a reason. The master was just looking for a reason to lash out at somebody. Mm-hmm. So he didn't have his face washed. So ironic, again, this idea that you have to keep up the facade, so be morally upright. So he finishes saying grace, and then once that sort of sacred moment, quote unquote, has passed, then he beats the guy up.
Yeah, it's this kind of hypocrisy, right, that we do sometimes see in Victorian society.
So this next letter is an anonymous letter complaining of the cruelty of a particular workhouse master. It's dated for 17th of May, 1842, and here's what it says. Honored sir, I hope you will pardon my presumption in addressing this to you, but the treatment that I have received here compels me to it. I have a little boy, only 8 years old, who has been cruelly beaten by the master, and is still very bad. Another sister was driven from the house and struck by the master, and when I complained to the guardians, they only laughed at me. I hope you will order the case to be investigated, as I have no other place to apply to, not knowing the assistant commissioner's name or address. Signed, a pauper. Very, very, very sad that this is the case, that this little boy has been beaten. The sister, it sounds like, has run away, and she's complained to the guardians, and they have absolutely no pity.
Yeah, again, it just reinforces this idea of how people view the lower classes not having very much worth, and even children as well. It kind of reminds me of the phrase children should be seen and not heard, which was so kind of characterized in a lot of people's minds. It kind of characterized the Victorian era. Mm-hmm. It just feels like that sentiment times 1,000 when you look at how this boy was treated.
Yeah. Newsflash, this entire episode is going to be sad, essentially. There's not really a whole lot of positive thing. Although we do have one positive account of the workhouse, which we'll get to.
I think we sense, and I don't think this is necessarily the case for all of the Victorian era, but here I really just sense this lack of compassion and lack of regard and value for human life in these excerpts.
It really is astounding. Like, our 21st century brains find this hard to comprehend, but the concept of value on human life, of social justice, really didn't exist. Maybe apart from missionaries, and there was some interesting work there. But
and even the concept of labor laws and standards, right? And like even regulations surrounding child labor, it just was not even really a thing at this point. And especially because this wasn't even a regular workplace. This was supposed to be government aid, but I would definitely not call it that.
It's not helpful, I don't think, for most of these people, besides the fact that they're able to just subsist and not starve, and they have a roof over their head, but who knows what kind of sort of terrible sleeping conditions they even have.
Yeah, it's like, what quality of life are they being saved from and saved to?
Yeah, you really get a picture through these accounts of why people didn't want to go here. Mm-hmm. Okay, so we've got one more account, which is actually quite interesting because it is, on the whole, positive. So this person who wrote this letter, which was written 19th April 1841, doesn't really have too much to complain about, actually, when it comes to the workhouse. So this is from John Yates, is his name. It reads as follows. In consequence of the many very unfavorable reports which appear every week in some newspapers respecting the working of the new poor law, I have considered it to be my duty to bear my humble testimony to the favorable workings of that measure myself, hoping that your honours will pardon me for the liberty I thus take. About 3 years ago, I was taken ill in this town at a distance of nearly 50 miles from the parish I belonged to, and as I got but very little work during the previous winter, I had neither the means for paying for medical aid nor of supporting myself in my illness. So we're getting sort of the reasoning why people would end up having to go to the workhouse here. Application was therefore made for me to this parish for medical aid when Mr. Fletcher, one of the medical officers of this union, attended me, and I'm certain that he did everything in his power to restore me to health, but my disease, which I believe was inflammation of the lungs, daily gained strength, so much so that everyone who saw me thought it would be impossible for me to recover, and I was for several weeks insensible to everything around me. All this time, Mr. Fletcher was as attentive to me as if I had been able to pay well for his services, and I must ever consider that it was in consequence of his skill and attention that I was ever restored to health and strength, which I am thankful I still enjoy. By my illness, I was brought down as to be unable for some time after the fever abated to even cross the room without assistance. I therefore am in need of further relief, which was also given to me such as was suitable for me in my weak state. When I had gathered a little strength, so as to be able to walk about a little without the assistance of a walking stick, I was ordered into the Bromsgrove Union Workhouse. I had heard of so many unfavorable reports regarding the treatment of the inmates of workhouses under the Poor Law. I felt a great reluctance to go there, but as I was unable to work, I had no alternative. When I got there, it was represented to be where the inmates are fed on worse than felons' food, but I found it an asylum where I was treated with humanity and fed on wholesome and substantial food. I still feel thankful that I found in a time of need such an asylum, a union workhouse, the new Poor Law, and I shall ever feel grateful to Mr. Fletcher, the medical officer of that union, for his care during my illness, and also to Mr. and Mrs. the Governor and Matron of the Bromsgrove Union Workhouse in this kind treatment I received. I am, Honourable Sirs, your humble and obedient servant, John Yates.
This is an interesting one, being that it's a positive account, like you said. And I think it's an important one as well, to read also the positive accounts, not so that we can be like, oh, actually, workhouses were great. Just to help us more fully understand, I guess, the whole picture of life in the Victorian workhouse, and also the experiences of poor people, that they weren't all universal. So like this entry or this letter in no way discredits the other letters. You know, it's not to say, oh, they were all lying, the workhouses were great, but I think it just showed the variety of treatment that the paupers would have received. And it, you know, it could depend on things like which workhouse you were in, or, you know, who the master was at the time. It could have depended on all these things. So I think it's important to kind of give color to this era, that there were a variety of experiences, and some people may have had good experiences. Maybe they were some of the people that had that foot up kind of thing. Maybe they got special treatment, but it obviously doesn't discredit the fact that there were largely horrific experiences in the workhouse.
Well, exactly, the experiences were varied, and maybe some people, for them, the workhouse was just what they needed at the time that they needed it, and it was able to actually help them get back on their feet, which I'm sure was kind of the intended purpose of these. At least from the outset when they were first imagined. But at the same time, it's quite interesting that this almost reads like a propagandist letter. And he says, I'm trying to actually deal with some of this stuff I'm reading in the newspaper and say it wasn't all that bad. I would never go so far as to say this is fake or this isn't real. But obviously, if he has had this experience, he's still reading himself a lot of news that testifies to the terrible experiences that are quite common. So he really feels a need to highlight each bit of his positive experience and really drive home the fact that it wasn't that bad. Yeah,
he refers to it as an asylum, which, you know, like it does seem in its wording and nature a little bit like propaganda. Not to say that it is, but it just in the way that he describes it as this like heavenly like place.
It's definitely over the top, yeah. And maybe he was encouraged because he was one of who knows how many might have been in this workhouse, but he was one who had a good experience, and so he was encouraged to write this, and who knows. But anyway, kind of interesting to read. Okay, so the last thing we're going to read is about a scandal that broke to the public in 1894 regarding union schools. So union schools, they were involved with the Poor Laws, so essentially workhouses for kids or training areas for kids. And this nurse was accused of doing all sorts of terrible things to the children who were in her care. Here is some of the testimony from the trial. Walter Gibbons, age 7, stated that the prisoner being the nurse Gillespie, who was in charge of the kids at this school, stated that the prisoner had knocked his head against a wall and ducked his head into a fire bucket. She'd also hit him with a cane. He'd done a basket drill with only his shirt on and had been caned if he dropped anything. So this basket drill was where they had to take their laundry basket, essentially, carry it on their heads, and if anything fell out, they would be beaten. Elizabeth Fawcett, aged 13 years, stated that the prisoner had slapped her face, pulled her hair, and struck her with a frying pan. The prisoner used to send Alice Payne out for stinging nettles. She then used to lay the children on the bed and thrash them with the stinging nettles on their bare backs. Witness had seen the children compelled to kneel on the wire netting that covered the hot water pipes. Witness also saw the prisoner throw a boy named Charles Williams out of bed. The boy's eye was cut against the bedstead, and the prisoner then sent him to the infirmary to have it strapped up. Witness had 12 strokes on each hand with the cane when she was an infant, and all the punishment was inflicted at one time. Absolutely crazy. Other witnesses apparently reported that this nurse was repeatedly drunk and just was totally nonchalant about how she abused children. And this was often the case. We mentioned this earlier. Boarding schools sometimes were what played host to this type of behavior. But these union schools, the workhouses, absolutely horrible places to be.
I mean, I feel like this nurse, she's more of an anomaly in terms of, the way that she treated. I wouldn't go as far as to say, children were always treated like this by all authorities in the workhouses, but it comes back to that idea of like a low view of working class children, I think in particular as well. That idea of children should be seen and not heard, but taken to the even more of an extreme. I
think children were just seen as nuisances and inconvenience, really. But it's surprising to see that this is the type of thing that was going on. So yeah, I think you're right. This is probably an anomaly. That's why it was given so much press coverage. It probably wasn't the rule. Might have been the exception to the rule.
I mean, this is some horrendous treatment. Right?
But it's interesting that there was rules about how you should treat kids. Yeah. The Poor Law Commissioners had rules and regulations that said, for example, no child under 12 years of age shall be punished by confinement in a dark room. No corporal punishment shall be inflicted on any female child, which we've just seen that was obviously not the case in this particular instance where this infant was beaten. No corporal punishment shall be inflicted on any male child except with a rod or other instrument as has been approved. So they still approve corporal punishment, but it's only in certain cases. So they have these rules, and yet a complete lack of regard for those rules by this person who is in charge of these kids.
Yeah, and you wonder how genuine the people were who instituted the rules. Was it just kind of like a surface level, let's put these rules in to placate the public, or were they genuinely passionate about it and the people running the workhouses just didn't implement it?
Yeah, we've talked about this the whole episode, but really poor people were seen as lazy, good for nothing. Really, they'd just fallen on hard times. That's why people ended up in the workhouse for the vast majority of people. I mean, we've read a little bit about alcohol addiction. I'm sure that would have been in existence in some cases, but it really was through no fault of their own often that they ended up here. They couldn't find a job or they were injured, and it was very unlikely any employer would be willing to take them on. So unless they have family looking out for them, they end up in the workhouse.
Yeah, and the idea of the welfare state wasn't established at this point. So really there was no help for these people.
Yeah, it's very sad. They really had no choice, and this was what was available to them. So anyways, guys, hopefully that gives you a glimpse into what life was like in the Victorian workhouses. Hopefully that gives you a bit more appreciation for some of those people who had to endure those horrible conditions. Thank you so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed the episode.
We will catch you next time, next Tuesday, when we'll be talking about Charles Dickens.
As always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, email us at theirownwordspod@gmail.com.